No, I was intrigued when you said the Enlightenment ignored our spiritual connection with history, or certainly
Yes,
an awareness of history, and it made me think of the museums. That they generally the museums start with Roman artifacts in England, at
right,
least, and there's so much
right.
before that, including the megalithic structures. But
Yes, yes. I mean, the thing is that the British English history is so fixated on the Roman Empire for a number of reasons, and it ignores its own pre-Christian. I don't like the term pagan because it's actually a Catholic word that is does not describe a lot of diversity, pre-Christian diversity actually. But I guess you would call them pagan. But the native Celts and Druids the British Isles and various peoples who lived all over really constitute the historical background. But when the British Empire really was in high gear in the 16th century and in the 17th century, when the major universities were really invested in, they underwent a tremendous task of appropriating for themselves the history of the Roman Empire, and they established something which we now take for granted called the Western heritage or the Western tradition. And so British history basically appropriated a perhaps false construct which the Italians developed during the Renaissance, in which primarily Byzantine history was appropriated from the Eastern Roman Empire, which was in the Balkans. It's in Serbia. It's in Bulgaria, in Romania, in Greece, and it was transposed. A lot of the same stories and figures and people were renamed and transposed into Italy. Then the British basically then saw this this construct that was built in the Renaissance, and they took it for themselves. So it's people take academic history for granted, but so much faith is involved in believing what these historians have written, and they've actually tried to create this view that there's a continuity between the high ideals of, say, Greek democracy, and that somehow British feudalism and the Magna Carta in the 13th century and so on and so forth is a direct continuity from the Greek Western heritage tradition. It's quite a ridiculous proposal, really. But the Enlightenment, coming many centuries later, really failed to understand the complexity of the human experience, and it tried to formalize. There are some useful products which can be used in a small scale. The French Revolution, for example, produced sociology, and it's pretty useful because, for example, when we look at things like deviance or criminality, we can understand that if poverty rates are higher or if there are social conditioning factors which lend towards it, that criminality will increase. So this did help us understand the world in some ways. I mean, there was a time in the past when you might just blame the individual or you might blame the spirits, and these are not things which are necessarily untrue either. But it certainly the problem is that for people trying to understand this, we tend to want to take a black and white view of everything instead of looking at imperfect knowledge which has been transmitted, which we have created or has been transmitted to us over time. So there are some truths in some of the liberal philosophy, and liberal philosophy is not a coherent body. It disagrees with itself. There are good liberal critics of liberalism, and some of the best criticisms of modernity, or rather progressivism and liberalism, come from institutions which liberalism built. So there are some contradictions in there as well, right? But certainly we live in an interesting time where now, for the first time since the period around the Second World War, the very, very foundations of a Western model are being questioned almost uniformly around the world. And when some Western Europeans and the Americans, and we're talking about the government and the elites, not the people, when those elites from Western Europe and America talk about this country or that country being isolated, By and large, those countries are far more connected and have far better relationships with the real rest of the world than do the United States and Western Europe. When they say that Russia is isolating itself, it actually has a much better relationship with India and with China, where actually half of the world's population lives between those two countries and the general region, right? So there's a sort of colonial or imperial hubris which says that the 500 million people in Western Europe and the 300 million people in the United States are the world. And that's actually less than 1/7 of the total world population. So when we talk about who's cut off from who, it's really Western Europe and the United States that are isolating themselves. And they don't control the discourse, and they're not going to write the future. You see, all of the books that haven't been written yet or that are being written right now are being written in China. They're being written in India. They're being written in Latin America, you see. And those are the books that people are going to learn and study. So this whole project for 500 years is actually coming to an end. It's really quite fascinating.
It is. It is. We all feel it one way or another. Would you, thank you.